This is Audible.
Hanover Square Press and Harper Audio present The Last Bookshop in London, a novel of World War II, by Madeline Martin. Performed by Saskia Malveld. One. August, 1939. London, England. Grace Bennet had always dreamed of someday living in London. Never did she imagine it would become her only option, especially not on the eve of war. The train pulled to a stop within Farringdon Station, its name clearly marked on the wall inside a strip of blue set within a red circle. People hovered on the platform, as eager to get on as those within were to get off. They wore smartly cut clothing in the chic styles of city life, far more sophisticated than in Drayton, Norfolk. Equal parts nerves and eagerness vibrated about inside Grace. "We've arrived." She looked at Viv beside her. Her friend clicked the top on her lipstick tube closed and gave a freshly applied vermilion smile. Viv glanced out the window, her gaze skimming the checkerboard of advertisements lining the curved wall. "After so many years of wishing we could be in London." Her hand caught Grace's in a quick squeeze. "Here we are." Back when they were mere girls, Viv had first mentioned the notion of moving away from dull Drayton for a far more exciting life in the city. It had been a wild concept then, to leave their slow-moving, familiar existence in the country for the bustling, fast-paced pulse of London. Never had Grace considered it might someday become a necessity. But then, there was nothing left in Drayton for Grace anymore. At least nothing she cared to return to. The ladies rose from their plush seats and took hold of their luggage. Each had only one case with them, faded things, beaten down more by age than use. Both were stuffed to the point of near bursting, and were not only impossibly heavy, but awkward to manage around the gas mask boxes slung over their shoulders. The ghastly things had to be brought with them everywhere, per the government, to ensure they'd be protected in the event of a gas attack. Lucky for them, Britain Street was only a 2-minute walk away, or so Mrs. Weatherford had said. Her mother's childhood friend had a room to let, one she'd offered a year ago when Grace's mother first passed. The terms had been generous, 2 months for free while Grace acquired a job, and even then the rent would be discounted thereafter. Despite Grace's longing to go to London, and despite Viv's enthusiastic encouragement, Grace had remained in Drayton for nearly a year after, in an attempt to pick up the pieces of her broken existence. That was before she'd learned the house she'd lived in since her birth truly belonged to her uncle, before he moved in with his overbearing wife and 5 children, before life as she knew it shattered even further apart. There was no room for Grace in her own home, a point her aunt had been eager to note often. What had once been a place of comfort and love became a place Grace felt unwelcome. When her aunt finally had the temerity to tell Grace to leave, she knew she had no other options. Writing the letter to Mrs. Weatherford the previous month to see if the opportunity still held was one of the hardest things Grace had ever done. It had been a surrender to the challenges she faced, a terrible, soul-crushing failure, a capitulation that had rendered her the greatest failure. Grace had never possessed much courage. Even now she wondered if she would have managed her way to London had Viv not insisted they go together. Trepidation knotted through her as they waited for the train's gleaming metal doors to part and unveil a whole new world. "Everything will be brilliant," Viv whispered under her breath. "It will all be so much better, Grace, I promise." The air-powered doors of the electric train hissed open, and they stepped onto the platform amid the push and pull of people coming and going all at once. Then the doors shushed closed behind them, and the gust of the train's departure tugged at their skirts and hair. An advert for Chesterfields on the far wall displayed a handsome lifeguard smoking a cigarette, while another poster beside it called on the men of London to join the service. It wasn't only a reminder of a war their country might soon face. but how living in the city presented a greater element of danger. If Hitler meant to take Britain, he would likely set his sights on London. "Oh, Grace, look!" Viv exclaimed. Grace turned from the poster toward the metal stairs, which glided upward on an unseen belt, disappearing somewhere above the arched ceiling. Into the city of their dreams. The advert was quickly forgotten as she and Viv rushed toward the escalator and tried to tamp down their delight as it effortlessly carried them up, up, up. Viv's shoulders squeezed upward with barely restrained happiness. "Didn't I tell you this would be amazing?" The enormity of it hit Grace all at once. After years of dreaming and planning, here they were in London. Away from Grace's bully of an uncle, out from under the thumb of Viv's strict parents. Despite all of Grace's troubles, she and Viv swept out of the station like caged songbirds, ready to finally spread their wings. Buildings rose into the sky all around, making Grace block the sun with the palm of her hand to see their tops. Several nearby shops greeted them with brightly painted signs touting sandwiches, hairdressers, and a chemist. On the streets, lorries rattled by, and a double-decker bus rumbled in the opposite direction, its painted side as red and glossy as Viv's nails. It was all Grace could do to keep from grasping her friend's arm and squealing for her to look. Viv was taking it in too, with wide, sparkling eyes. She appeared as much an awed country girl as Grace, albeit in a fashionable dress with her perfectly styled auburn curls. Grace was not as chic. Though she'd worn her best dress for the occasion, its hem fell just past her knees, and the waist nipped in with a slim black belt that matched her low heels. While not as stylish as Viv's black and white polka dot dress, the pale blue cotton set off Grace's grey eyes and complemented her fair hair. Viv had sewn it for her, of course, but then Viv had always seemed to both of them with an eye set toward grander aspirations. Throughout their friendship, they had spent hours sewing dresses and rolling their hair, years of reading Woman and Woman's Life on fashion and etiquette, and then making countless corrections to ensure they lost the Drayton from their speech. Now, Viv looked like she could grace one of those magazine covers with her high cheekbones and long-lashed brown eyes. They joined the flurry of people rushing to and fro, heaving the bulk of their suitcases from one hand to the other, as Grace led the way toward Britain Street. Thankfully, the directions Mrs. Weatherford had sent in their last correspondence had been detailed and easy to follow. What had been missing from the account, however, were all the signs of war. More advertisements, some calling for men to do their part, with others prompting people to disregard Hitler and his threats, and still book their summer holidays. Just across the street, a wall of sandbags framed a doorway with a black and white sign, proclaiming it to be a public air raid shelter. True to Mrs. Weatherford's directions, they arrived at Britain Street within 2 short minutes and found themselves in front of a brick townhouse. It had a green door with a polished brass knocker and a flower box filled with purple and white petunias in the window. Based on what Mrs. Weatherford had written, this was unmistakably her house. And their new home. Viv charged up the stairs, her curls bouncing with each step, and rapped on the door. Grace joined her at the top, spurred on by the anticipation jolting through her. After all, this was her mum's dearest friend, the one who visited them in Drayton several times in Grace's youth. The friendship between Grace's mother and Mrs. Weatherford had begun when Mrs. Weatherford had lived in Drayton. Even after she moved, it had continued on through the Great War that took both their husbands' lives, and through the illness that had finally taken Grace's mother. The door opened, and Mrs. Weatherford, looking older than Grace remembered, appeared in the widening doorway. She'd always been pleasantly plump, with flushed apple cheeks and sparkling blue eyes. Only now she wore round spectacles, and her dark hair was laced through with strands of sparkling silver. Her gaze homed in on Grace first. She gasped softly and touched her fingers to her mouth. "Grace, you're the spitting image of your mum. Beatrice always was so pretty with those grey eyes of hers." The older woman opened the door wider, revealing her white cotton dress with blue sprigged flowers and matching blue buttons. Behind her, the entryway was small but tidy, filled almost entirely with a set of stairs that went up to another floor. "Please, do come in." Grace murmured her thanks for the compliment, downplaying exactly how much that praise tugged at the part of her that still mourned her mother. She heaved her suitcase through the doorway and into the home that held the savoury aroma of meat and vegetables in the warm air. Grace's mouth watered. She hadn't had a proper homemade meal since her mother's death. Not a good one, at least. Her aunt hadn't been much of a cook, and Grace spent too many hours running her uncle's store to prepare anything decent. A rug underfoot softened Grace's steps, cream-coloured with pastel flowers. Though clean, it appeared to be somewhat worn in patches. "Vivian," Mrs. Weatherford said as Viv joined Grace in the entryway. "All my friends call me Viv." She offered a smile at Mrs. Weatherford with her one-of-a-kind Viv charm. "What beauties you both have become. I reckon you'll set my boy blushing." Mrs. Weatherford motioned for them to rest their bags on the floor. "Colin," she called up the polished wood stairs. "See to the ladies' effects while I put the kettle on." "How is Colin?" Grace asked politely. Like her, he was an only child, left without a father after the Great War, as she had been. Though he was 2 years Grace's junior, they'd played together as children. She recalled those memories with great fondness. There had always been a gentleness to Colin, a genuine kindness behind the sharp intelligence of his eyes. Mrs. Weatherford threw her hands up in exasperation. "Trying to save the world one animal at a time, and bringing them all home." The good-natured chuckle that followed implied she didn't mind it as much as she claimed. Grace took a moment to admire the entryway as they waited on Colin. A table sat beside the stairs with a glossy black telephone atop it. The wallpaper was a cheerful blue and white brocade, somewhat faded, and matched the white painted doors and door frames. While simple in design, everything appeared immaculate. In fact, Grace was certain she would be hard-pressed to find a speck of dust on anything her mother's friend owned. A creak sounded, followed by footsteps coming down the stairs as a tall, slender man appeared. His dark hair was combed neatly, and he wore a collared shirt and brown trousers. He gave a shy smile, which softened his features and made him appear even more youthful than his 21 years. "Hello, Grace." "Colin?" she said, incredulous. He was almost a foot taller than her, towering over her as she once had over him. He blushed. His reaction was endearing, and it warmed her to know he hadn't lost his sweetness in the years that stretched between them. Grace gazed up at him. "You've certainly grown since I saw you last." He shrugged his skinny shoulders, looking perfectly bashful, before offering a slight nod to Viv, whom he'd played with as well since the two girls had always been inseparable. "Viv, welcome to London. Mum and I have been looking forward to your arrival." He slid a grin at Grace, then bent to grasp the 2 suitcases the ladies had set aside. He hesitated. "May I take these for you?" "Please," Viv said. "Thank you, Colin." He nodded and took 1 suitcase in each of his hands, carrying them easily up the stairs. "Do you remember visiting with Colin?" Mrs. Weatherford asked. "We do," Grace said. "He seems as kind as he's always been. Only much taller," Viv added. Mrs. Weatherford looked up the stairs with adoration shining in her eyes, as if she could still see him. "He's a good lad. Come, let's have some tea and I'll show you around." She motioned for them to follow and pushed open the door that led into a kitchen. Light spilled in from the window above the sink and at the back door, filtering in through parted gauzy white curtains. Everything was as pristine in her narrow kitchen as it had been in the entryway. The sun shone off clean white countertops, and a few dishes had been neatly set in a rack to dry. Towels the colour of lemons were draped on a rack, and the scent of whatever she was cooking was even more tantalizing. She indicated the small table with 4 white chairs to Grace and Viv, and lifted the kettle from the stove. "Your uncle picked a fine time to lay claim to your home with a war soon upon us." She carried it to the sink and turned on the tap. "And so very like Horace," she said with evident distaste over the rush of water. "Beatrice was worried he might attempt such a thing, but her illness was so sudden." Mrs. Weatherford flicked a glance from where she'd been watching the water level in the kettle to Grace. "I shouldn't be going on like this, what with you just getting in from travelling. I'm so pleased to see you here. I only wish it was under better circumstances." Grace bit her lower lip, uncertain what to say. "You have a lovely home, Mrs. Weatherford," Viv said quickly. Grace cast her a grateful look, which she answered with a conspiratorial wink. "Thank you." The older woman cut the tap and scanned her sunny kitchen with a smile. "My Thomas's family owned it for several generations. It's not as fine as it once was, but one makes do." Grace and Viv each slid into a chair. The lemon-printed cushion was thin enough to feel the hard wooden seat beneath. "We appreciate you allowing us to stay with you. It's very generous. Think nothing of it." Mrs. Weatherford set the kettle on the stove and spun the knob to turn the burner on. "There's not a thing I wouldn't do for the daughter of my dearest friend." "Do you think finding employment will be difficult?" Viv asked. Though she kept her tone light, Grace knew how much her friend longed to be a shop assistant. In truth, the idea was appealing to Grace as well. It seemed so glamorous to work in a department store, something fine and grand like Woolworth's, with floors of items that extended the length of an entire block. Mrs. Weatherford gave a secretive smile. "It just so happens I'm well acquainted with quite a few shop owners in London. I'm sure I can do something to help. And Colin works at Harrods. He can put in a good word as well." Viv's eyes lit up as she mouthed the store name to Grace, with barely restrained excitement. Mrs. Weatherford took one of the yellow towels and lifted a plate from the rack, rubbing away the few remaining drops. "I must say, the two of you don't sound at all like you're from Drayton." Viv tilted her chin a notch higher. "Thank you. We've certainly tried. We're hoping it will help with our employment." "How delightful." Mrs. Weatherford opened a cabinet and replaced the plate within. "I trust you've procured letters of recommendation already." Viv had spent the day before their departure to London with a borrowed typewriter, carefully typing a letter of recommendation for herself. She'd offered to do one for Grace as well, but Grace had refused. Mrs. Weatherford turned back to the drying dishes once more. Viv lifted her eyebrows at Grace, indicating she ought to have agreed. "We do have letters of recommendation." Viv spoke confidently for both of them, no doubt already scheming how she might produce a second one for Grace. "Viv does," Grace amended. "Unfortunately, I do not. My uncle refused to write a letter of recommendation for the time I spent at his shop. It had been his final offense, a retaliation for her abandoning the store where she'd worked for most of her life. He didn't seem to care that his wife had insisted Grace find another place to live, only that Grace would no longer be at his beck and call. The kettle gave a shrill cry and emitted a cloud of steam from its nozzle. Mrs. Weatherford pulled it from the stove, immediately cutting short its scream, and set it on a trivet. She tisked as she scooped a spoonful of leaves into the tea ball before adding the boiled water to the teapot. "That's a shame, a terrible shame." She muttered something under her breath about Horace, and settled the teapot on a silver tray with 3 teacups and a sugar and creamer set. She offered Grace a resigned frown. "They won't take you at a department store without one." Grace's stomach dropped to her toes. Perhaps she ought to have allowed Viv to forge her a letter after all. "However," Mrs. Weatherford added slowly as she carried the tray to the table and poured them each a steaming cup, "I have a place in mind where you could work for 6 months to obtain a proper letter of recommendation." "Grace would be ideal for whatever you're thinking." Viv took a lump of sugar from the bowl and let it plunk into her tea. "She's always had the highest marks in school, especially in maths. She practically ran her uncle's entire shop on her own and improved it greatly while doing so." "Then I think this will work out wonderfully." Mrs. Weatherford took a sip of her tea. Something nudged against Grace's shin. She looked down to find a young tabby cat gazing imploringly up at her with large amber eyes. Grace stroked her hand over the soft fur behind the kitten's ears, and a purr vibrated to life. "I see you have a cat." "Only for a few more days. I hope you don't mind." Mrs. Weatherford swept her hand to shoo the cat, but it remained stubbornly at Grace's side. "The rascal won't leave my kitchen any time he smells food." Mrs. Weatherford cast a chagrined look down at the little animal, who regarded her without guilt or shame. "Colin is a wonder with animals. If I allowed him to keep every wounded creature he brought home, we would have quite the menagerie." Her chuckle interrupted the steam rising from her tea. The cat rolled onto his back, revealing a small white star on his chest. Grace scratched at the spot, and his rhythmic purr rumbled under her fingertips. "What do you call him?" "Tabby." Mrs. Weatherford playfully rolled her eyes. "My son is far better at rescuing animals than naming them." As though summoned, Colin entered the room at that very moment. Tabby leapt to his feet and trotted over to his saviour. Colin lifted the kitten into his large hands, his touch gentle with the small creature who nuzzled affectionately against him. This time it was Colin Mrs. Weatherford shooed away. "Out of the kitchen with him! Sorry, Mum." Colin gave a quick, apologetic smile to Grace and Viv, then ducked from the room with the cat cradled to his chest. Mrs. Weatherford shook her head with affectionate amusement as she watched him depart. "I'll visit Mr. Evans to see about getting you secured in that position at his shop." She settled back into her chair and gazed out to the garden with a sigh. Grace glanced out the window, where a gaping hole showed in the earth, alongside a sad pile of uprooted flowers, and a stack of what appeared to be sheets of aluminium, most likely the beginnings of an Anderson shelter. Grace hadn't seen any in Drayton, where the chances of being bombed weren't high, but she'd heard of several cities where the Andes had been distributed. The small shelters were to be buried in the garden as a refuge if Hitler attacked Britain. A tremor of unease rippled down Grace's spine. Of all the times to finally make their way to London, it was at the start of a war. Now they were in the prime target for bombings. Not that returning to Drayton was an option. She would rather face the possibility of danger where she was wanted than contend with her uncle's hostility. Viv peered out the window curiously and promptly looked away. After a lifetime of farming, she was, as she put it, jolly well done with dirt. Mrs. Weatherford sighed again and took a sip of tea. "It was a fine garden once. It will be again," Grace reassured her with more confidence than she felt. For if there were bombings, would any garden ever be the same again? Would any of them, for that matter? Such thoughts nipped at the back of her mind and cast them in an eerie shadow. "Mrs. Weatherford," she said abruptly, no longer wanting to think of war or bombings. "May I inquire as to what sort of shop Mr. Evans runs?" "Of course, dear." Mrs. Weatherford set her teacup in its saucer with a clink, her eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "It's a bookshop." Grace masked a twinge of disappointment. After all, she knew very little about books. Any attempts at reading had been quashed by countless interruptions. She'd been far too busy at her uncle's store, trying to earn enough money for her and her mother's survival, to bother with reading. Then her mother had become ill. Uncle Horace's store had been easy enough to manage, especially as the household wares were items she personally used. Selling tea kettles, towels, vases, and other goods she was familiar with came naturally. But she knew nothing about literature. Well, that wasn't entirely true. She could still recall her mother's copy of Grimm's fairy tales, with an elegant princess painted on its front. How she'd loved letting her gaze wander over the colourful illustrations, while her mother's voice spun magic with those fanciful tales. But outside of Grimm's fairy tales, she'd never had time to read. "Brilliant!" Grace smiled brightly to hide her apprehension. After all, she would make do. Anything would be better than working at her uncle's store. But how was she possibly supposed to sell something she knew so little about? 2. Grace's first attempt with Primrose Hill Books did not go as planned. Not that she'd harbored lofty expectations for success, but she had anticipated the owner would at least be prepared for her arrival. She found the shop without issue, yet another testament to Mrs. Weatherford's fine directional abilities. The narrow shopfront was not located on Primrose Hill, as the name suggested, but rather was one of many in a line that ran along Hosier Lane, each with windows reflecting the dullness of the clouded afternoon sun. The bookshop's first 2 floors had been painted black, with a yellow stuccoed facade rising above it, cracked and faded with age. A white sign proclaimed Primrose Hill Books in a glossy black looping text. The effect was clearly meant to be elegant, but seemed to Grace as rather flat and cheerless. The sentiment was echoed in the shop's dingy windows, which were layered with lopsided strips of white scrim, rather than displaying a purposefully set, enticing display. The tape wasn't uncommon. Many had adhered it to their glass windows in shops and at home for prevention against shattering in case of a bombing. Usually, however, it was done neatly and with care. A pull of trepidation dragged at Grace once more. What if Mr. Evans asked her the last book she'd read? She drew in a deep breath to fortify herself and pushed into the shop. A little bell rang overhead, far too happy for a place so dreary. There was a mustiness in the air, mingled with a scent reminiscent of wet wool. Layers of dust on the shelves indicated most of the stock had not been touched in some time, and piles of books on the scuffed wooden floors lent it all a sense of disarray. This effect was heightened by a counter off to the right, which was cluttered with what appeared to be haphazardly stacked accounts amid a chaotic sea of pencil nubs and various other bits of rubbish. It was no wonder Mr. Evans required assistance. "Call out if you need something." The unseen voice was as dry and disused as the books. "Mr. Evans?" Grace made her way deeper into the small shop. Rows of unmarked shelves stretched high above her head, pressed so closely together she wondered how anyone might fit between them to peruse their contents. A second-story balcony curled around the perimeter of the first floor, visible above the towering shelves and just as overcrowded and messy. Despite its external size, the shop's interior had been rendered far too small and tight. Footsteps shuffled toward her as a portly man with white hair and bushy brows squeezed from a narrow aisle with an open book framed between his hands. He lifted his head from the pages and regarded her for a long moment without speaking. "Mr. Evans?" Grace stepped carefully around a knee-high stack of books. His eyebrows crawled up over his glasses. "Who are you?" Grace wanted nothing more than to navigate her way through the forest of shelves, back to the store's exit. But she'd arrived with purpose and put an edge of steel in her spine, as her mother had always encouraged. "Good afternoon, Mr. Evans. I'm Grace Bennett. Mrs. Weatherford sent me here to speak with you about a position for a shop assistant." His blue eyes narrowed behind his spectacles. "I told that meddlesome woman I didn't need help." "I beg your pardon?" Grace asked, taken aback. He looked down at his book and turned away. "There's nothing for you here, Miss Bennett." Grace instinctively took a step toward the door. I see," she stammered. "Thank you for your time." He didn't acknowledge her as he scooted between the bookshelves once more, in a clear sign of dismissal. She stared after him in shock. If he wouldn't hire her, would there be more options without a letter of recommendation? She knew no one outside of Mrs. Weatherford, Colin, and Viv. She was in a foreign city, away from a home where she no longer felt welcome. What else was she going to do? A panicked urgency ran through her veins and left her palms prickling with heat. She should stay and fight for the job. After all, she needed it. What if she couldn't afford the reduced rent on the room in 2 months' time? Certainly she couldn't bring herself to ask Mrs. Weatherford for more assistance on top of what she had already given. Nor would Grace rely on Viv's aid. All at once, the stuffiness of the shop became stifling, the towering shelves too pressing. She should stay and fight, but her emotions were too tumultuous. God, how she missed her mother's strength, her counsel and love. Without another word, Grace found her way to the front door, around tightly packed shelves and piles of books, and left the shop. She returned to Britain Street with brisk steps, wanting nothing more than to be alone. Solitude, however, was not to be had. Viv was in the parlour with Mrs. Weatherford, cooing over Tabby. Colin, who had worked all night at the Pet Kingdom in Harrods with a new baby elephant, was crouched beside the kitten with a bit of meat at the end of a spoon. Which meant all eyes turned to Grace the moment she closed the front door. Though she knew her friends meant well, she wanted to slink from their stares rather than divulge how she'd run from the first sign of difficulty. "How did it go with Mr. Evans?" Mrs. Weatherford sat forward in the burgundy armchair. Grace's cheeks burned, but she managed to force a smile and act nonchalant. "I believe he is not looking to hire an assistant." "Why ever would you assume such a thing?" Mrs. Weatherford asked. Grace shifted her weight from one foot to the other. The gas mask box on its slender string bounced against her hip. "He told me as much." Mrs. Weatherford pushed upright with a harumph. "Colin, put the kettle on." He looked up at his mother from where he sat on the floor beside Tabby, with a spoon perched between his large fingers. "Will you take your tea out here?" "It's not for me." She hastened to the stairs. "It's for Grace, who is no doubt in sore need of a cuppa while I go have a word with Mr. Evans." "Wait." Viv put a hand to Colin's shoulder before he could leave. She gave Tabby a scratch on the head and popped up from where she sat on the floor beside them. "Better than tea. Let us go explore London." She fanned her hands toward Grace. "You're already dressed so nicely, and I don't have my appointment until tomorrow afternoon. Let's go have a look about the city." Viv's appointment was an interview at Harrods, secured in part by Colin, with his influence of having worked there for several years, and also by her recommendation letter. While her position was indeed enviable, Grace would never begrudge her friend's happiness. And as much as Grace didn't want to leave the cool quiet of the house, Viv's smile was so wide with excitement, Grace found she could not say no. Viv readied herself with such haste she descended the stairs the same time as Mrs. Weatherford, both with their hats pinned into place and neat heels clicking over the polished wood surface. "You mark my words." Mrs. Weatherford glanced in a small mirror hanging beside the front door and adjusted the brim of her angular black hat. "Mr. Evans will hire you if he knows what's good for him." Grace wished she could protest, to stoutly deny her need for a job or the kind help Mrs. Weatherford offered. But alas, she could not refuse her charity. Uncle Horace had seen to that with his refusal to write a proper letter of recommendation. After so many years of restoring his shop, it seemed painfully unfair and cruel. Before she could even try to stop Mrs. Weatherford, the older woman disappeared out the front door, huffing with determination. Viv took Grace's hand. "Let us go see the gem that is London, darling," she said in her finest high society inflection. Grace couldn't help but smile at that, and allowed her friend to pull her off to explore, leaving Colin with Tabby. The women were soon swept up in the fast-moving city, amid tall buildings plastered with brightly coloured adverts and the rumbles and honks of traffic. They darted and dashed through it all, keeping to the quick pace of city life with each hastened step. But London was not the gem they had anticipated. Her sparkle had been dulled by the effects of an oncoming war, glued together with scrim tape and apprehension. Her shine was masked behind walls of sandbags, and her soul unearthed to make way for shelters and trenches. Such warnings were impossible to ignore. In Drayton, where an attack was less likely, some preparations had been apparent. But there, the tape lining the windows had been idle amusement, and the greatest lurking fear was rationing rather than bombing. In London, such actions were done with blood-chilling necessity. The evidence could be pushed aside temporarily, of course, like when Grace and Viv entered Harrods for the first time and encountered the elaborate scrollwork along the ceilings, the Egyptian-painted columns and exquisite fanning lights. The store went on as far as the fields in Drayton, each new department more exciting and elaborate than the last. There were silk scarves so fine it felt like Grace was touching air, and perfumes set behind glittering glass counters that scented the air with an expensive musk. The most fascinating by far was Pet Kingdom, where Colin worked. The baby elephant he'd spent the night soothing now frolicked about in a pile of clean hay, while a leopard cub raked its textured pink tongue over its pelt and watched them with curious green eyes. "Imagine," Grace said dreamily as they left the animals and drifted through the other departments. "You will soon work here as a shopper's assistant." "And you'd be with me," Viv whispered, "if you'd let me write you a letter of recommendation as well." Grace's excitement wilted somewhat at the reminder of where she'd end up instead if Mr. Evans caved to Mrs. Weatherford. He seemed a brusque man in a store filled with wares she knew little about. And yet she could not bring herself to present a false letter of recommendation. She'd never been good at lying, going all red about the face and tripping over her words. No doubt she'd fumbled falsified information just as greatly. Still, she knew Viv wouldn't let it drop unless given some sort of concession. "Perhaps if no further opportunities are presented, I may reconsider," Grace said slowly. Viv's face lit up. "Consider it done. Only if no further opportunities are presented," Grace repeated. Suddenly hopeful Mrs. Weatherford might get her way with Mr. Evans. But Viv had turned away to examine the pair of stockings and merely acknowledged Grace's careful statement with a hum. Viv set the item aside, her hand splayed over its crinkly pink package. "You know what we haven't done yet?" She spun toward Grace with such enthusiasm, her green skirt flared out around her knees. "We haven't gone to Hyde Park!" Grace grinned. How many countless summer days had they lain in the sun-warmed grass, breathing in its sweet scent as they pretended to be in Hyde Park. "It's only just up the road," she said with a lift of her brows. Viv glanced around the brightly lit rows of endless elegant displays. "If we can find the way out." Grace craned her neck, searching without success. It took longer than either cared to admit, and they became lost somewhere between the bedding department and brassieres. But they were finally able to locate the exit and went up the street into Hyde Park. What they'd been expecting were clusters of deck chairs filled with extravagantly dressed people, the expanse of the Serpentine catching the sunlight like winking diamonds, and a lawn of endless green grass so soft it would tempt them to remove their shoes. They had not anticipated the trenches gouged into the soil like open wounds. Or, worse still, the massive guns. The hulking metal bodies rose taller than a man, supported by wheels so large they came up to Grace's waist. A long barrel protruded from each beast, jutting toward the sky, ready to take down any threat. Grace looked up into the heavy grey clouds, half expecting to see a fleet of aircraft in its murky depths. "Don't trouble yourself worrying about Germany, ladies." An older man paused before them. "Those anti-aircraft guns will shoot them out of the sky before they can touch us." He nodded with self-satisfied assurance. "You'll be safe." Grace's stomach clenched and robbed her of any words. Viv seemed similarly affected and merely offered a weak smile. The man touched the brim of his hat and resumed his path across the park, with a newspaper under his elbow. "The war really is coming, isn't it?" Viv said softly. It was. They all knew as much, even if they didn't want to admit it. Already holidays had been cut short when teachers were asked to return home early to begin preparation for the likelihood of the evacuation of thousands of children from London. If they were planning to remove the children to the country, war would surely be soon upon them. Still, there was a resignation in Viv's statement that plucked at a guilty string in Grace's chest. "You don't need to be here, Viv. It isn't safe. You only came to help me, because I was too scared to come on my own. You could go back to Drayton." Viv's lips curled up with mirth. "I'd rather die than go back and bury myself up to the elbows in dirt again." "We just might, even still." Grace didn't verbalize the macabre thought, but she did glance back once more at an anti-aircraft gun, dark and ominous where it rose against the afternoon sky. "War hasn't even been declared yet." Viv adjusted the balance of her purse strap and the string of her gas mask box on her shoulder. "Come, let's return to Mrs. Weatherford's and see if she was able to talk some sense into Mr. Evans." Grace made a sour face at her friend. "He doesn't want me there any more than I want to be there. The shop is old and dusty and filled with books whose titles I've never even heard of." A sparkle lit Viv's eyes. "That's why it's perfect for you, ducky." Grace couldn't help but smile at the endearment. Her mother had first called her that as a toddler when her blonde curls flipped out at the base of her neck. Like a little duck's tail, Mum used to say. The moniker stuck. With her mother now dead, Viv was the only one who still remembered, and used the nickname. "Your uncle's shop was a dusty bit of nothing before you stepped up." Viv put her hands on her hips. "And something tells me Mrs. Weatherford will strong-arm Mr. Evans into a letter of recommendation in 6 months if he dares to refuse." The image of Mrs. Weatherford haranguing Mr. Evans into submission was almost laughable. Now there would be a battle of wills. "I know who I'd put my money on." Viv winked. "Let's go see what she's accomplished." By the time they returned to Britain Street, Mrs. Weatherford was already in the parlour with a cup of tea, as the scent of roasting meat filled the air. Yet another delicious meal, no doubt. Mrs. Weatherford had quite the talent in the kitchen, the same as Grace's mother. Mrs. Weatherford looked up from her teacup and waved the fog of steam from her glasses. "Ah, there you are. Mr. Evans will pay you a fair wage and would like you to start tomorrow morning promptly at 8. Grace slid her low heels off and, without bothering with her slippers, padded onto the thick pile carpet in the parlour. "You mean—" A victorious smirk touched Mrs. Weatherford's lips. "Yes, dear. You are the new assistant at Primrose Hill Books." Relief wrestled with trepidation. It was a job, one that would guarantee Grace a livelihood in London. With it, perhaps she could finally put Drayton and her uncle successfully behind her. "Thank you for speaking with him, Mrs. Weatherford," Grace said gratefully. "It was so considerate of you." "It was my pleasure, dear." The slight puff to the older woman's chest indicated that it had indeed been her pleasure to do so. Grace paused. "Might I ask why it's called Primrose Hill Books, when it isn't on Primrose Hill?" Mrs. Weatherford gave a dreamy smile that told Grace the reason was a good one. "Mr. Evans and his wife, God rest her soul, met on Primrose Hill. They propped their backs against the same tree and discovered the other reading the very same book. Can you imagine?" She took a tea cake from the tray and held it pinched between her fingers. "When they opened the shop, they said it was the perfect name for a bookshop they shared. Quite romantic, isn't it?" It was almost impossible to imagine the stodgy old shop owner as a young man in love. But the shop name was indeed charming, as was the story. Perhaps working at the store would not be so terrible. And anyway, it would only be for 6 months. 3. Grace arrived at Primrose Hill Books at 10 minutes to 8 the next morning, with perfect curls and jangling nerves. Viv had helped set her hair the night before, and rose early to wish her luck, despite her own interview with Harrods not being until that afternoon. Grace would need all the luck she could get. Mr. Evans was behind the cluttered counter when Grace entered. He wore a tweed jacket with a collared shirt underneath, and didn't bother to look up at the ding of the bell. "Good morning, Miss Bennis," he said in a bored drawl. Grace smiled at him, determined for a fresh start with her best foot forward. Or her other cheek turned, depending on how one looked at it. "Good morning, Mr. Evans. I truly appreciate you giving me the opportunity to work in your shop." He lifted his head and regarded her through the thick glass of his spectacles. His wispy white hair and overgrown eyebrows appeared as tamed down as they might ever be. "I don't need help, but that woman wouldn't let me be until I finally agreed." He wagged a stubby finger at her. "And don't you be locking your heart into this task, Miss Bennet. It's only for 6 months. Grace's shoulders relaxed somewhat with her relief. At least he wouldn't expect her to be at the shop for the rest of her life. "I won't become attached," she answered truthfully. How could she possibly, with a place so dusty and desolate? She scanned the shop and was struck anew with how cramped the space seemed. Shelves were crowded against one another like big teeth in a small mouth, amid errant piles of scattered books. All without any sense of rhyme or reason. At least when Grace had begun at her uncle's shop, there had been some semblance of order. What was she to do with this haphazard chaos? A sense of hopelessness crept in. After all, where was she even to start? Did Mr. Evans already have expectations he wanted her to meet? She stood awkwardly in a state of uncertainty with her purse and gas mask box on her shoulder, still wearing her hat. Mr. Evans did not appear to notice as he scrawled a series of numbers into a ledger. The pencil tip was carefully pinched between the pads of his fingertips. One more sharpening and the thing would be non-existent. Grace cleared her throat. "Where am I to set my belongings?" "Back room," he muttered, as his hand continued to move against the paper. She glanced to the rear of the store and saw a door, presumably where she was being directed. "Then what would you like me to do?" The lead of the pencil snapped, and Mr. Evans hissed out an exhale of frustration. He levelled a stare at her. "I told you I don't need help. You can sit in the back room and sew, or settle into a corner with a book to read, or file your nails. I don't care." Grace nodded and slipped down the misaligned aisle of shelving toward the door he'd indicated. Above it was a dingy brass placard with Primrose Hill Books engraved at its top. and a small line of words beneath, "Where readers find love." Hopefully it was an omen that her 6 months might not be all bad. The room was narrow and dimly lit by an uncovered bulb, with a flimsy table and chair. Boxes lined every wall, sometimes layered 2 and 3 deep, minimizing the space so that one could barely move. It was far less welcoming than the shop itself, which Grace hadn't thought possible. She located several hooks on the wall where she hung her effects, and went back to the main area of the shop. She'd never been one for sewing, that was Viv's area of expertise, and wouldn't know where to start with which book to read, let alone how to shelve them. A glance at her nails, however, had her lamenting having forgotten her nail file at home. There was nothing for it but to find something to do. The thick layers of dust on the shelves begged to be wiped clean. Granted, dusting the shop hadn't been on the list Mr. Evans had recommended, but the shop was in sore need. 3 hours later, nearly choking on dust motes in the air, she regretted her choice. Her white shirt dress with sprigs of pink flowers, one of her favorites, was streaked with grime, and Mr. Evans glared in her direction every time he coughed, which was quite often. Through it all, several customers had come and gone. She'd tried to linger near them as she worked, employing considerable care to not send dust clouds in their direction, but still close enough should they require help. Not that she would know what to do if they asked her a question. Fortunately, no one did, at least not until 5 minutes after Mr. Evans departed to a nearby cafe for tea. An older woman in a checkered pinafore house dress approached, with her gaze fixed on Grace. "Excuse me, do you have the black spectacles?" Grace smiled easily. At least this was a question she could answer. "We don't carry spectacles here. I'm terribly sorry." The woman blinked her wide blue eyes. "It's a book. By John Dickson Carr. I finished The Crooked Hinge last night and just had to find the next edition in the Gideon Falls series." If the earth were to open up at that moment and swallow Grace whole, she'd offer no protest. She had 2 book names and a series to work with, and no idea where any of them might belong. While cleaning, she'd tried to find some order to the layout of the books, to no avail. "Oh, of course." Grace waved for the woman to follow her in the hope she might somehow have the dumb luck of stumbling upon the book by happenstance, or be struck by lightning on the way. She'd accept either at that point. "Did you find The Crooked Hinge exciting?" Grace asked tentatively, in an effort to glean what type of book she was seeking. The woman pressed her palm to her chest. "Oh, it was the best kind of mystery. I locked myself in my bedroom for the last chapter so I could finish it without the children interrupting." Ah, yes, a mystery. Maybe there was some located near the back where she was currently leading the woman. "I believe it will be somewhere on this wall." Grace's gaze skimmed over the spines of multiple books, none of which were in any order, not by title or name, or even color of the book jacket. "If I may..." A masculine voice spoke from behind Grace. She leapt in surprise to find a tall man in a finely tailored grey jacket, with his black hair combed neatly to the side. She'd noticed him earlier. After all, what woman would not when he was so handsome? But it happened rather a while ago, and she'd assumed he'd already departed. "I believe it's on the shelf on the far wall." He glanced toward the opposite side of the shop. "Yes, thank you." Grace's cheeks burned. No, her whole body burned, flaming with an embarrassment made all the more scorching by the man's gaze on her. She indicated the woman follow once more. "If you'll come this way, please. If you don't mind, miss." The woman looked pointedly at the handsome man and blushed. "I'd rather he show me." His eyebrows went up with surprise, and he gave a rich chuckle. "By all means." He offered his elbow to the elder woman, who took it with a beaming smile. Grace watched the two with amusement as the gentleman took down a black book with bold red type on the front. The woman thanked him and met Grace at the cash register on the cluttered counter. What a gentleman! The woman patted her reddened cheeks before removing the payment from her purse. "If I were as young and pretty as you, I don't think I'd let him leave without finding out his name." Grace flicked an anxious glance at the man to ensure he hadn't heard the woman's statement. He remained facing a shelf several paces away, apparently oblivious. Thank goodness. The tension in Grace's shoulders eased somewhat. She counted out the woman's change, thanked her, and handed her the purchased book. The housewife gave her a quick wink and exited the shop, sending the little bell chiming. When its ring cut off, a heavy silence filled the cramped space. While Grace had been oblivious to the man's lingering presence in the store earlier, she was keenly aware of it now. If this had been the shop in Drayton, she could offer to assist him, perhaps make a few suggestions. As it was, he appeared to know the store better than she. She discreetly brushed as much of the lingering dust from her dress as possible and vowed not to wear anything white again until the shop had been thoroughly cleaned. In the end, she opted to tidy the bits and bobs scattered over the counter as she waited for him to make his selections. She found an old cup in one of the cabinets below, where she gathered the pencil nubs, each worn nearly to its end. Next, she disposed of the scraps of rubbish, but only after confirming they were not in fact account slips, as the two often looked similar. The gentleman was standing before the partially cleared-off counter when Grace looked up. He smiled at her and met her gaze with the most striking green eyes. There was a slight cleft in his chin, which complemented the sharpness of his jaw nicely, and made him as alluring as one of the actors in a cinema production. Grace's mind tripped over itself for something fascinating to say, and quickly came up empty. "Is there something I can help you with?" He nudged the stack of books on the counter toward her, books she'd been too lost in his beautiful eyes to notice. "I'd like to purchase these, please." He put his hands casually in his pockets and settled into the wide-legged stance of a man intent on conversation. "I've never known Mr. Evans to have a shop assistant." Grace punched a button on the old National Cash Register, and its accompanying thwack resounded in the empty shop. "It's my first day." She cast him a sheepish glance as she reached for the next book. "It was kind of you to help earlier. Thank you." His smile widened and made the smooth skin around his eyes crinkle at the corners. "It's the least I could do. I've been coming regularly since I was a boy. I noticed you've cleaned the place up a bit. That's quite the task to take on." "I'm looking forward to the challenge," Grace replied, realizing the truth behind her words. If nothing else, putting the shop in order would help fill her time over the next 6 months. "It will be a challenge indeed." The man glanced behind him with an exaggerated grimace. "Especially if you're a book lover. Mysteries could easily be thrillers, classics could easily be love stories, and on with all that." "I'm not," she confessed. "A book lover, I mean. I haven't had much time for books." He drew up slightly, almost as though affronted by her admission, though his smile did not waver. "Well, if you were to start with any of them, I'd suggest The Count of Monte Cristo. It's a classic I've always enjoyed." He tilted his head. "Though it could also be a love story." "I'll take it into consideration." Grace lifted the last book to ring up. "Thank you for the recommendation." He took out his wallet and paid for the books. "May I be so bold as to ask your name?" "Miss Grace Bennet," she replied. "Miss Bennet." He nodded politely. "I'm George Anderson. I look forward to seeing what you do to the shop." She nodded mutely, and Mr. Anderson departed, walking backward as he did so, to cast her one last devastating grin. Heavens. She put her hand to her chest as though she could slow its rapid beat. Just then the chimes sounded at the door once more, and Mr. Evans filled the shop with his cranky disposition. His gaze scoured the organized countertop, and his furry eyebrows wriggled with apparent consternation. "What the devil happened here? Have we been robbed?" "I tidied up," Grace replied. Mr. Evans scowled and glared around the shop. "That's why it's so dusty in here." He waved in front of him with a folded newspaper, as though the air itself issued great offense. She tensed, waiting for cutting words such as those her uncle had so often thrown at her. In all the years she'd worked for him, from the first day she'd completed the final year offered at the schoolhouse in Drayton, until when she'd left for London, he had pointed out, in great detail, all of her many failures. Her work ethic was not on par with what he expected. She wasted product that could still be used. She could have sold more items with her suggestions if she'd been smarter, more intuitive, more driven, less incompetent. She clenched her hands into fists and squeezed, bracing herself for the emotional blows on her personal deficiencies. "I suppose it does need a good scrubbing down," Mr. Evans grumbled in begrudging acquiescence. Her fists relaxed. "I beg your pardon?"
"The place is a bit dusty, and I haven't the time to muddle with it."
He slapped the paper on the countertop and took the stack of receipts, ignoring several that fluttered free.
"I'd thank you not to go looking through my accounts."
"I'd never presume." Grace bent to retrieve the scraps of receipts and handed them to Mr. Evans, taking care to keep her gaze averted from the neat print. He tucked them into the pile of papers and disappeared into the little room at the back of the shop. He did not emerge for some time, and when he did, he remained at the rear, sifting through the books, more like a customer than the shop's owner. Grace spent the remainder of the afternoon finishing her dusting and polishing the counter. It was really quite nice underneath years of grime, with carved scrollwork at its corners and a lovely chestnut hue. Fortunately, no other patrons sought her help with their selections, and her only task with the customers involved gathering their payment. When at last it was time to take her leave, her announcement to Mr. Evans was met with a grunt of acknowledgement, and little else. Though dirty, exhausted, and feeling like she hadn't done nearly enough, Grace eagerly rushed home in anticipation of hearing how Viv's interview went. She flung open the front door upon her arrival. "Viv, did you—" The wireless was turned to full volume, and a voice crackled throughout the parlour, informing listeners that a fleet had been mobilised. A fleet of what? Mrs. Weatherford and Viv sat before the radio, listening intently. Viv shot her a distracted glance and waved her over. Grace quickly joined her friend on the blue mohair sofa. "What's going on?" she whispered. "Why is the broadcast on? It's not 6. Viv cast her a nervous glance. "News came this afternoon. The reserves have been called. We were informed earlier that we shouldn't conclude war as inevitable. But how can we not when they're telling us that fleets are mobilised and all naval reservists and remaining Royal Air Force personnel should report for duty?" Grace fell back against the couch in stunned shock. How had she heard nothing about this? But then she'd been in her own world, busily cleaning, her mind set to task with determination, and her customers few and far between. The anticipation vibrating in the air now hummed in Grace's veins. This was it. War. Mrs. Weatherford said nothing, her face a stoic mask. She stood abruptly and snapped off the wireless. "That's about enough for one day." She drew in a deep breath and turned to Grace. "I trust your first day went well." "Yes, thank you," Grace replied softly. "Good." Mrs. Weatherford gave a perfunctory nod. "If you'll excuse me, I have a kidney pie to prepare, or we won't have a thing for supper." Without waiting for another reply, she marched out of the room, her back unnaturally straight. Viv lowered her voice. "They're evacuating the children tomorrow, all of them to the country, at least the ones whose parents signed them up to go." The news struck Grace in the chest. Viv was right. How could they not expect war when such measures were being implemented? Grace thought of the housewife who'd been in the store earlier, selecting a book without the knowledge that her children would be leaving the following day. All the mothers of London would be losing their children due to the evacuation, and many of them would also be sending their husbands to war. If not enough men volunteered, they might be conscripted. Grace's stomach gave a slight flip. Colin might be called up. It was no wonder Mrs. Weatherford had been so disinclined to hear more. Viv stared down at the carpet, solemn. A knot of fear tightened in Grace's chest, and she fought for some levity, lest they both give in to hopelessness. "The children will be fine, as long as they don't end up with my uncle and his family." Viv offered a sad smile as she played along. Not that he'd offer them a place anyway. It was then Grace realized Viv was still wearing her smart navy suit. "Did you have your interview?" Viv nodded. "I was offered a position as a shopper's assistant. I start tomorrow, for however long it will last now." "It will last quite a while, I'm sure." Grace squeezed her friend's hand. "Everyone always needs a pair of stockings or a new blouse to make them feel fine." "Or an elephant?" Viv tilted her head. "Perhaps a wombat." Grace shrugged. Viv's mouth stretched in a ghost of a smile. "Maybe even a cheetah." "Don't forget its lead," Grace cautioned. Viv's expression turned serious. "We'll make it through this, Grace Bennet. Just you see." She clasped her hand over Grace's, a reminder of the camaraderie they'd shared since childhood. That solidarity had helped them survive the pain of Grace's mother's death, the drudgery of life in Drayton, Viv's overbearing parents, and even the incessant teasing of Geoffrey Simmons, the dolt. Together, they would be able to take on anything thrown at them, whether it be a curmudgeonly shop owner or a coming war. 4. The queue of children was tragically endless. In truth, Grace hadn't had much chance to think of the evacuation. There had been too much activity the evening before as they prepared for the first night of the government-mandated blackout, while Colin put the final touches on the Anderson shelter in Mrs. Weatherford's poor, torn-up garden. The ruined flower beds had been mentioned several times by Mrs. Weatherford, despite her sniffed remarks that she didn't care a whit. Through it all, Grace was ashamed to admit she hadn't remembered about the children. Not when she'd left Britton Street to make her way to Primrose Hill Books. Especially not when she'd caught sight of strange silver balloons in the sky, as large as townhouses and suspended above the city like bloated silver fish. Odd things that no doubt served some purpose of war. She stared up at one so intently as she turned down Albion Place that she nearly crashed into a man in a blue wool Royal Air Force uniform, with his full kit slung over one shoulder. "Forgive me," Grace said. "I didn't—" Whatever else she meant to say died on her tongue, for that was when she caught sight of the children. The queue ran down the length of the street, heading in the direction of Farringdon Station. The RAF officer replied, but she didn't hear him as he strode briskly past. She couldn't take in anything more than the endless stream of children with their small gas masks hanging from strings at their sides, their information pinned on their jackets, and their bags of belongings. Such small bags for what might be a long absence, for who knew when the children would return? Some were eager, their faces bright in anticipation for an adventure. Others were tear-stained as they clung to their mothers. As for the women accompanying them, each one was pale, their expressions steeled against the agony of their task. No mother should suffer a choice such as theirs, to send their child to live with a stranger in the country, or allow them to stay in the city where it was dangerous. Despite the pain of separation, there must truly be considerable risk if they were going to the effort to remove so many children. Certainly it was far better than keeping them here, where they were under the constant threat of being bombed. Though Grace was not a mother, she hoped to become one someday. So it was that every stricken visage drove into her heart the sacrifice these women were making to ensure their children remained safe. As Grace walked on in her stunned state, she came upon the mass of them congregated at the entrance to Farringdon Station, where another stream of children came from the opposite direction. Hundreds, if not thousands. Many mothers would have empty arms this night. A heaviness lay in Grace's chest for those women and the little ones they had to send off to another's care. She quickened her pace, unable to endure the sight any longer. She all but threw herself into the bookshop, earning her a sharp look from Mr. Evans upon her arrival. "Has the war already started?" he asked dryly, and returned his focus to the book in front of him. "It might as well have." Grace glanced out to the street as a mother hastened her 2 young children in the direction of the tube station. "The children are all being sent away." He hummed in distracted agreement. She peered up to the sky, seeking the large silver objects. "And those balloons—"
"Barrage balloons."
She turned back to him. "What on earth are those?" Mr. Evans sighed without patience and set his book down.
"They're affixed to steel cables and prevent aircraft from flying too low. They're there for our protection."
"So they can't bomb us then?" Grace asked hopefully.
Mr. Evans snorted. "Oh, they can bomb us well enough. The balloons prevented it in the Great War when planes couldn't fly as high, but now at least it forces them up into the range of the anti-aircraft guns."
Chills prickled over Grace's skin. She wanted to ask more questions, but he'd already lifted his book and resumed reading. A few customers entered the store that day. It was easy to see why when the children were being shipped off, the men were leaving for war, and all the mothers were left behind with their heavy sorrow. Grace had thought to try organizing the books, but could not clear the image of those children from her mind. Not when there had been so very many of them. Not when their mothers had been so strong in the face of what they must do to have their children protected. She recalled the time her mother had gone to visit Mrs. Weatherford once when she was a child. Though Grace had stayed with Viv's family for the week, she still remembered how missing her mother had left her feeling bereft. And that had been only a week. Those poor children. In the end, Grace applied herself to the messily placed scrim on the windows, peeling away first the tape, then picking at the adhesive that remained in sticky patches along the glass. The task was mindless, which suited her well, for her mind was entirely overfull already. When there were only 2 strips left and she was debating whether or not she had time to reapply more tape with proper care, Mr. Evans came to her.
Go home, Miss Bennet. There's not enough business to even bother staying open. Not today. Besides, I haven't anything to black out the windows when it grows dark.
He folded his arms over his chest and his inhale whistled through his nostrils as he looked about his shop.
War is coming, and books aren't what people will be shopping for.
Grace gathered the discarded tape and stood. But surely they need entertainment. He nodded to the windows.
I'll bring in newspaper tomorrow.
Grace hid her grimace of distaste at the thought of layering the wide windows with plastered news sheets. I can make curtains. Mrs. Weatherford has quite a bit of fabric on hand already. We've some to spare. Indeed, Mrs. Weatherford had been quite elated to crow over her victory at getting so many yards of heavy black sateen at only 2 shillings a yard. Grace didn't know why she was offering to help Mr. Evans, especially when he was implying he soon may not have the business to support hiring an assistant. But they had the fabric to spare, and anything she could do to remain useful enough to glean a letter of recommendation would work in her favor. Grace quickly gathered her purse, hat, and gas mask, eager for the extra time off. Mr. Evans met her at the entrance and flipped the sign from open to closed.
Good afternoon, Miss Bennet.
He closed the door behind her and locked it. The children were gone from the streets by that point, almost as if their organized departure hadn't happened. On her walk home, Grace pushed her thoughts from the painful recollection and instead considered how to draw more customers into Primrose Hill Books. She'd done it with her uncle's shop. Several signs in the window and a few items placed strategically on sale had made all the difference. Soon customers had come with regularity. Of course, there were fewer patrons at Primrose Hill Books, and the ones remaining perched on tightly strung nerves. But books served a purpose. Distractions were always needed, most certainly in times of strife. If she made one store successful once, by God, she could do it again. And this time she'd jolly well make sure she received a glowing recommendation for her efforts. She met Mrs. Weatherford just outside the townhouse, the older woman's arms laden with bags. Mrs. Weatherford waved her over with half of a finger, which appeared the only appendage she had to spare.
Your timing is impeccable, Grace. Come here, child.
Grace rushed over and pulled several totes from Mrs. Weatherford's arm. An unexpected weight tugged at Grace's hand with such force she nearly dropped the parcel. What do you have in here? Sandbags? Mrs. Weatherford cast a conspiratorial glance around before leaning in and whispering, tea. She lifted one shoulder to heft another sack. And sugar. Now come, let's get this inside quickly. She didn't speak again until they spirited the packages into the house and safely tucked them in the kitchen. The heavy dark curtains hung from the windows in the otherwise cheerful kitchen, a reminder of the blackout starting that evening. There had been several test runs the previous month, but this time would be in earnest. Mrs. Weatherford dropped her burden with great care and issued forth a relieved sigh. Heavens, but that was heavy. This is all tea and sugar. Grace surveyed the bags, which were stuffed to the seams. Some of it is flour, too. Mrs. Weatherford wagged a finger. Don't you go looking at me like that, Grace Bennet. The war is coming, and you mark my words, there will be rationing. I had to get to these items before the hoarders. Grace regarded the trove of dry goods. The hoarders? Mrs. Weatherford set to work, unpacking her wares. Mrs. Nesbit had at least twice as much, and she's a woman on her own. Mrs. Weatherford bent over the counter to rearrange objects in the cabinet, making space for her new purchases. You know her, the proprietress of Nesbit's Fine Reads, one of the many illustrious bookshops along Paternoster Row. She glanced at Grace for confirmation. Grace shook her head. Mrs. Weatherford's brows furrowed. Surely Mr. Evans has mentioned Paternoster Row.
He hasn't. Grace stacked several bags of sugar in a cleared spot in the open cabinet. Mrs. Weatherford shifted aside some boxes and replaced them with tins of tea. Well, that street is where most book lovers with good money go. I've told Mr. Evans a dozen times he should relocate. She took a step back and inspected the stacked cabinet with a satisfied nod. You should go sometime, see what a proper bookshop looks like. I can give you directions. A proper bookshop? It was exactly what Grace needed to study to see how to improve Primrose Hill books. That would be wonderful, she said. While we're on the topic, would you mind if I took some of the black sateen to make curtains for the shop? Mrs. Weatherford cast a proud smile at her, the kind her own mother once gave. It touched a wounded place inside Grace, somewhere buried deep, and soothed it in the gentlest way. Of course you may, dear, the older woman said. Mind that you do at least 3 layers or it won't block out a bit of light. I'm sure he's very appreciative of your efforts. She filled the kettle with water from the tap, even if he doesn't say as much. Colin came into the kitchen with Tabby following at his heels, mewing insistently. Hello, Grace. His cheeks coloured with a slight blush, as always happened when he entered a room Viv or Grace were in. We received a baby cheetah this morning. There's almost nothing to him, just a bit of fluff and a fierce personality. He made the shape of a ball with his fingers to indicate the animal's size. I imagine he must be darling. You'll have to come by and see him next time you're at Harrods. He glanced to his mother. Can you hand me a tin of tuna, Mum? Mrs. Weatherford's mouth pinched, but she handed him the tin regardless. I think Tabby is large enough to find a home. Soon we'll be sore pressed to feed ourselves, let alone a cat. Colin took the can with a rueful smile. You both think I'm mad, but I tell you, everything will be rationed. Mrs. Weatherford folded the now empty totes and put the full kettle on the stove, while Colin peeled the top off the tin with a can opener. A pungent fish odour filled the small space and sent Tabby in a frenzy of emphatic cries. Mrs. Weatherford waved at the air. Save yourself, Grace. Put the wireless on while I fetch your tea. Grace didn't need a second offer and quickly fled the odoriferous room. However, when she snapped on the set, the news greeting her was far worse than the smell of fish. Lionel Marson's rich voice emanated from the speakers. Germany has invaded Poland and bombed many towns. Grace stood stock still, her hand hovering over the metal knob. On he went, detailing how Poland had been attacked that morning, how major Polish cities had been bombed and France was mobilizing. With the agreement of mutual assistance being signed with Poland only days before, there would be nothing for it. Great Britain and France would have to intervene. The rest of the afternoon and evening was spent in the parlour as each new bulletin aired, everyone perched in a desperate bid for more information. Much of what was said they already knew, but listened intently regardless. Through it all, Grace made curtains for the shop with Viv's help once her friend came home from a successful first day at Harrods. With nerves on high alert, they picked at Mrs. Weatherford's pork pie and prepared for the blackout before the sun had fully set. Hitler could do to England what he'd done to Poland. Any sliver of light at a window could tell his planes where to drop their bombs. A chill of anticipation squeezed down Grace's spine. She'd been dreading the blackout and its strict rules. Now she was grateful for the government's foresight in keeping them from being a blatant target in the dark night. Likewise, she was appreciative for the Anderson shelter in the back garden. Knowing they had protection in such proximity lent her a calming sense of security. Amid the pure darkness of their first blackout, Grace had difficulty finding sleep, especially when her mind was filled with talk of war, and her thoughts kept returning to the children from that morning. Apparently the heavy curtains did their job too well. Grace did eventually fall asleep, but the next morning she awoke nearly half an hour later than intended. Despite her rushed attempt to get ready, she still made it to the bookshop several minutes late. Mr. Evans glanced up at her arrival, his face dour. No doubt a rebuke was coming. Grace clutched her bag, the triple-layer blackout curtains within. And here I thought you might have abandoned the place as a lost cause. A smirk lifted the corners of Mr. Evans's mouth as he wandered back toward the rear of the shop. Not that I'd have blamed you.
"I'm sorry for being late," she called to his back and exhaled slowly. "I brought the curtains." He looked over his shoulder toward her bag and nodded once. It was as much of a thank you as she'd expected. She tidied the shop first, cleaning the piles of receipts and bits of rubbish she'd left on the counter. Though she knew little of the books they sold, she chose covers with appealing fronts and displayed them in a curved arrangement in the large windows. It was a start, at least. She had just located a small ladder and was preparing to hang the heavy curtains when the jingling bell announced a visitor. An old man entered and caught her with his sharp gaze.
"Who are you?"
"Miss Bennet." She climbed down from the ladder. "The new shop assistant." At eye level, it was impossible to ignore how very much the man resembled a bird set against the bitter wind on a cold day. His downy white head was set low into the shrug of his hunched shoulders, and his spindly legs jutted from the bulk of his dark jacket. He glanced at the curtains waiting to be hung and tutted.
"No need for curtains when tar would work just as well."
Grace nearly cringed at the idea of smearing tar over the glass. "May I help you?"
"Where is Evans?" "Pritchard, is that you?"
Mr. Evans emerged from the forest of shelves, an ever-present book propped in his hands just over the paunch of his belly. He snapped it shut and pushed his glasses higher on the bridge of his nose.
"You hired an assistant?"
The man looked around the shop, his beak of a nose exacerbating his bird-like appearance.
"Are you doing all that well, then?" "You never know what you'll need when a war is on," Mr. Evans answered dryly. "Comparing our bookshops again, Pritchard?"
The man clicked his tongue.
"Bah, war hasn't even been declared yet. And if this mess with Poland pushes us toward it, we'll show Hitler and his nasties a battle that will send them scuttling back to Germany. Mark my words, this will all be over by Christmas." "I'll still take my curtains."
Mr. Evans nodded toward Grace, releasing her from the need to be party to the conversation.
"If nothing else, it'll keep the bloody ARP wardens from knocking at my door."
Grace gathered the slippery fabric in her arms, climbed the ladder, and proceeded to hang the curtains while the men discussed book sales and politics.
"How the devil do you keep mice from your store?"
Mr. Pritchard asked abruptly as Grace finished her task.
"I've had issues with the buggers from the first." "It's never been a problem."
Mr. Evans's tone was becoming distracted, a clear indication he was finished with the chat. A social cue Mr. Pritchard had failed to grasp. The man tucked his head deeper into his shoulders and scowled.
"Most likely because you're not as close to the Thames all the way out here. Not like I am at Paternoster Row."
"You need a cat," Grace said as she climbed down from the ladder and examined her handiwork. "Mrs. Weatherford's son has a tabby cat who needs a home." Mr. Pritchard scoffed.
"That meddlesome woman."
Grace busied herself folding the ladder to hide her frown at his unkind assessment of the woman who had done so much for her. "A cat should help with the mice. I have it on good authority Mrs. Weatherford has no plans this morning, and would likely appreciate the call. At least to the point of finding a new home for Tabby." Mr. Pritchard nodded slowly to himself.
"I see. Well, it appears I might as well see about a cat. Good day to you, Evans."
Mr. Evans muttered some form of farewell, and Mr. Pritchard left the shop. With the curtains properly hung and a decent display in the windows, Grace turned to her next project, finding places to relocate the piles of books scattered about the floor. The task was far larger than she'd anticipated. Whatever shelving system Mr. Evans had once incorporated was now nearly non-existent, which meant Grace needed to create her own. Eventually. For now, she simply found places to put the discarded tomes. She'd become so engrossed in her task, Mr. Evans had to remind her on several occasions that she had stayed beyond her allotted hours. Each time she'd put him off, saying she was nearly done, and each time she thought she truly was, only to discover more stacks. A low rumble of thunder caught her attention, and Mr. Evans appeared before her with an umbrella in hand.
"Miss Bennet, go home. The shop is closing and it's begun to rain."
She looked up from a row of spines pressed so tightly together no book could possibly fit between them, despite the 20 or so more she still had to put away. They weren't in any order, yet, but at least they were off the floor. She glanced toward the window and found the curtains drawn. The blackout was clearly in effect. Had it really become so late?
"Stay home tomorrow," Mr. Evans said. "You've put in far too much work for one day.
But yesterday
You were supposed to leave this afternoon, and it is now night."
Mr. Evans pressed the brolly toward her once more.
"If Mrs. Weatherford calls one more time for you, she'll have my head."
Ah, there it was then, Mrs. Weatherford. No doubt Grace's delay had caused her to worry. Grace accepted the umbrella and quickly gathered her things. Mr. Evans followed her to the front and opened the door. Blackness met her on the other side, as stark as it was deep, an endless sea of nothing. Grace blinked as if to clear her vision, but it did no good against the true and complete darkness. She hadn't realized the blackout would be this all-consuming.
"I should walk you home," Mr. Evans said,
more to himself than to her. "Think nothing of it." Grace notched her chin a little higher, the way Viv did when putting her confidence on full display. Though in Grace's case, it was mere bravado. "It will take me less than 10 minutes. We needn't both end up drenched." He frowned and opened his mouth to say something when a sharp whistle pierced the air.
"Put out that light!"
someone called from the distance. The self-important authority to the tone suggested an air raid precautions warden, the volunteer service made up of neighbours who monitored blackout compliance. "Good night, Mr. Evans." Grace slipped out of the shop as she snapped open the brolly. Still, Mr. Evans waited, holding the door open for her.
"Put it out, Mr. Evans!"
the ARP warden shouted again, this time closer. Finally, he let the door fall closed, and a thick blanket of darkness fell over Grace. It seemed to press against her eyes, making her strain to see something, anything, and failing miserably. Usually there were people about, cars with bright headlights slicing through the pitch black, and lampposts with a golden glow in a radius beneath. But not now. Not during a blackout. She hesitated where she stood in an attempt to gain her bearings, which didn't seem quite able to sort themselves out. Rain pattered on her umbrella while she remained in place. She would have to move based on memory in the absence of sight. It was fascinating how only a week of being in London resulted in her being able to picture the path to Britain Street with such ease. Except that had been when she could properly make out her surroundings. She took a cautious step forward, the scuff of her shoe loud in the empty street. She half expected an obstruction to trip her up. It didn't. Nor was the next step impacted, or the one after that. She continued with the strange, hesitant shuffle of her feet on pavement that rasped against the bottom of her shoes. How many steps was it to the street? Her pace faltered, and she found herself stretching her free hand in front of her, patting at air. Maybe she should go back and take Mr. Evans up on his offer to walk her home. But then, how would he return to the shop? Her nerves felt as though they were uncoiling with each blind step, her senses on wild alert. A rumbling filled the silence of night. It came with such haste, she drew back quickly, stumbling in the process. The whoosh of a car with its headlamps off sped by, dragging her skirt in a gust of powerful wind as it splashed what must have been a bucketful of puddle water on her. Her dress clung to her, ice-cold and drenched with filthy rainwater. She wrapped her arms about herself as she clutched the brolly handle. Not that it mattered if rain fell on her now. Lightning flickered overhead, casting the world in a brilliant wash of light. It was enough to make out what direction she needed to go, as well as confirm there were no more cars making their way toward her. Drenched, blind and freezing, Grace stumbled her way back to Britain Street, one careful footstep and flash of lightning at a time. The usual 10-minute journey took an eternity. Who knew how much time she'd wasted repeatedly walking past Mrs. Weatherford's townhouse in a fruitless bid to identify the right door? Finally, she managed to ascertain which was indeed the correct home, and carefully climbed up the stairs. Her shoes were so thoroughly soaked, they seemed to...
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.